Thank you very much for being here. So I have here my email address, and this is so that if you have any questions or comments after the talk, please do get in touch with me. I'll be very happy to talk about these issues. And if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to interrupt. I'm very happy to take questions during or after the talk. Okay, so I'm an anthropologist by training. So anthropology is a study of the human species, broadly defined. It's a study of our evolutionary history. It's a study of human behavior. It's a study of various other features of our species. And one of the key areas of interest of anthropology is study of the variation in different human societies, and just trying to understand where these societies come from biologically, how they are determined, if they are determined biologically indeed, and how we explain these through history and other various processes. So this is very dark, but it's to illustrate this notion that there is a lot of variation in human cultural practices. So these are the 56 ethnic groups that are recognized by the Chinese government as living in China today. So each group has a unique combination of marriage strategies, language, subsistence strategies, and so forth. So compared to other species, compared, for example, to our closest relative, chimpanzees, we have this great degree of cultural diversity, of variation in behaviors. How do we explain this variation? Indeed, they do. But they all celebrate different things. Okay. So one thing that anthropologists have been very interested in is the study of kinship and marriage systems. Now, kinship systems are the ways in which societies organize relatedness. So just to give you an example, in Western societies, we think of ourselves as being equally related to cousins on our mother's side and cousins on our father's side. But there are societies in which individuals think that they are more closely related, for example, to their cousins on their father's side. So there is a lot of variation in these things. Marriage systems are the ways in which societies think about reproduction, how they organize and structure reproduction. So to continue with this example, in some societies, cousin marriage is forbidden. In other societies, cousin marriage is actually the preferred form. Now, if you're an anthropologist like me, you're actually very interested in these issues. And you're interested in these issues because they get at some of the big questions about our evolutionary past. So in traditional societies, for example, social structure is organized around these features, around kinship and marriage. So who you're related to determines who you interact to, who you marry to obviously relates to the groups that you interact to. Now, of course, who you are related to and who you marry also determines the pattern of genetic diversity. So if we are to understand what we see in the genetic data these days, we are to understand how people mated and reproduced and how they structured themselves in the past. And finally, if you're an archaeologist and you want to understand what happened in the past, then you also want to know how people organize themselves. So, for example, if you find a big house, does this mean that families were very large, or does this mean that this was some other structure where people perform social functions? So, kinship and marriage systems allow us to answer some of these questions. However, there are some questions that are actually relevant to society today that kinship and marriage systems are also relevant for. So this is an article from The Guardian. It's a couple of years old. In the UK, where I did my PhD, there's a large Pakistani community, and the Pakistani community is one in which cousin marriage is actually the preferred form. So every now and then, politicians come up with this idea that we should forbid cousin marriage because cousin marriage has some health implications. So to actually understand why these communities have for many centuries practiced cousin marriage can actually help us understand whether we should make policy decisions that forbid this particular form of marriage or not. Another article from The Guardian, this is about a year old, and it reports the story of a female Saudi journalist who is writing, who wrote an article in a Saudi newspaper arguing that Saudi women should be allowed for husbands because Saudi men, or Muslim men in general, are allowed for wives. And of course, this wasn't taken very well by some of the male establishment in Saudi. So understanding why there are these differences in marriage patterns, for example, is also useful in addressing some of these questions. So I will talk today specifically about monogamous marriage, and this speaks to this issue of understanding where polygamy comes from and where monogamy comes from. So let me just tell you very briefly what I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about pair bonds. Pair bonds are the sort of relationship between husbands and wives exist in both monogamous and polygamous societies. And I'm not talking about sexual monogamy. Sexual monogamy doesn't really exist in very many societies, whether they practice monogamous or polygamous marriage. So I'm sorry?
What was that last sentence?
So I'm not talking about a system of sexual monogamy. It doesn't, as far as we can tell from the data we have, strict sexual monogamy does not exist in very many societies. So I'm talking about a system of monogamous marriage that is a system where any form of polygamy. Okay, so just one more slide about the monogamy. Monogamy is the marriage of one husband and one wife. Polygyny is the marriage of one husband to multiple wives. Polyandry is the marriage of one husband and polygyny is the marriage of multiple husbands and multiple wives. Now, often with polygyny, but in fact, polygamy means any form of monogamy. So I'll try and be specific and use polygyny when I mean the marriage of one husband to multiple wives, and polygamy when I mean any form of non-monogamy. Okay, now one thing that comes as a surprise to many people is that when you look at the distribution of marriage strategies across human societies, the vast majority of societies allow polygynous marriage. Now this is a sample, it's called the Santa Cruz Cultural Sample. It was put together by Murdoch and White in the 60s, and it's a sample that is representative of variation in human cultural practices. In this sample we have societies as data points. So a village in Italy, for example, is counted as a society. A rural village in the US would be another society. So this has nothing to do with number of people in polygynous or monogamous marriages. This is just a number of societies that allow polygynous marriage, a number of societies that allow, a fraction of societies that allow polyandrous marriage, where one wife is allowed to marry multiple husbands, and then societies that inform strict monogamy, that inform monogamous marriage. It's about 17% of societies. Now, again, to speak to this notion that this isn't saying that the vast majority of men in the world are married polygynously. So if we break down this in societies that allow polygynous marriage, we see that about under 2/3 have what we call limited or occasional polygyny, where less than 20% of married men have more than one wife, and about 1/3 of these polygynous societies are what we call generalized polygyny societies, where more than 20% of married men have more than one wife. So again, to show you that it's not to say that all men in these societies have multiple wives, but there's simply no norms against polygamy in these societies. Okay. Now, so the question we're trying to answer is, how do we explain the fact that some societies enforce monogamous marriage? Now, in sort of evolutionary anthropology, there is this distribution, or the prevalence of polygynous marriage is explained as follows. Now, if we look at the distribution of breeding systems in mammals, then we find that the vast majority of species of mammals practice some form of polygynous breeding, where one male mates with multiple females. And some 10% of species have monogamous breeding, where one male mates with one female. And in turn, to explain this, biologists use what is called Bateman's principle. So Angus Bateman was a geneticist, a Scottish geneticist, who in the 1940s did an experiment where he put Drosophila, so fruit flies, into bottles, and he had these Drosophila males and females mate, and he then counted up the number of offspring per number of mates. And as you can see, for males, there is a sort of linear relationship between number of offspring and number of mates. So the more mates a male has, the more offspring. For females, this relationship doesn't really hold. So for females, whether you have one mate or three mates, it doesn't really affect the number of offspring. Yes?
How many
Uh-huh. Right. No, this is only including whether simultaneous spouses are allowed or not. Okay. So Bateman's principle, and one way to phrase Bateman's principle is to say that in species that reproduce sexually, so where we have males and females, the variance in number of offspring for males is greater than the variance in number of offspring for females. Another way to phrase this is to say that males have a greater reproductive potential than females. A male can impregnate many females. The females, once she's pregnant, she's pregnant. So based on this principle, biologists explain this distribution of breeding systems in mammals by saying we see a prevalence of polygyny because in the vast majority of species, males are taking advantage of this higher reproductive potential. There is a small fraction of species where they can't really do this for various ecological or social reasons, and so these are the species where we find monogamy. So taking this, anthropologists explain the prevalence of polygynous marriages, saying, this simply reflects the prevalence of polygynous breeding in our class, or in mammals. It's an interesting explanation for this, but it doesn't really tell us anything about societies that are non-polygynous. Now, the interesting thing about polygyny is that besides being prevalent in the ethnographic record, restrictions on polygyny are actually very old. So if we look at the very earliest legal document that we have, the Code of Hammurabi, which is about 4,000 years old, then we have some restrictions on polygyny. So the Code of Hammurabi says that under normal circumstances, males should have only one wife. They could have a second wife if the first wife was ill or infertile, or they could have a second wife if they really wanted to, but they needed permission from the first wife. Now, if we look at the Roman case, men in this society, ancient Rome and ancient Greece too, were only allowed one wife. So marriage in Rome was strictly monogamous. Now, the Roman case is very interesting to us because, of course, we have a lot of data. And the fact that we had a lot of data tells us that, yes, marriage was strictly monogamous, but mating was, in fact, highly polygamous. So, for example, we have a lot of evidence telling us that wealthy Roman men had sexual access to a very large number of female slaves, and they fathered offspring from these slaves. And this behavior was, to a great degree, socially condoned. So this sort of begs the question of why some societies forbid polygynous marriage when they, in fact, allow polygynous mating. And one possible answer is that marriage strategies have more to do with the transfer of property than they have to do with mating and the production of children. Now, so if we believe this, then when we're talking about monogamous marriage, we're really talking about a form of monogamous inheritance.
Roman anthropology?
No. Okay, I'll get references from you later. So we're really talking about a form of monogamous inheritance. Now, inheritance is important because if you look at traditional societies, this doesn't really hold for contemporary societies, but for traditional societies, there is a strong relationship between wealth and reproductive success, where reproductive success is the currency of evolution, if you like. So I'm showing you here just a couple of examples to illustrate this notion. So the Chewa are a horticulturalist population living in southern Malawi. Being horticulturalists, we can measure the wealth in size of the garden they farm, and there is this relationship between residual fertility, which is a measure of reproductive success, and wealth. Similar relationship holds for the Gabra, who are pastoralists living in northern Kenya, where we find this relationship between number of camels in this case and residual fertility. So as I said, this is just to illustrate this relationship between wealth and reproductive success. In traditional societies, we have many, many examples of this. So the question that we're asking is, if indeed wealth is a correlate of reproductive success in traditional human societies, where reproductive success is the currency of evolution, then can we understand marriage strategies as the outcome of some strategic allocation of resources to the next generation? And together with my co-author, Mark Archetti, who's a theoretical biologist currently at Harvard, and University of Basel in Switzerland, we have come up with two intuitive principles for why we may see monogamous marriage as a form of monogamous inheritance. The first principle is what I call the principle of depletion through division, and the second principle is what I call the principle of high paternity for exclusive investment. So I'll talk you through these. The first one is the principle of depletion through division. Okay. So here's a monogamous family. The male should be blue, but it's pink on the screen. It's blue on my screen. And the female should be pink, but it's blue on the screen. So anyway, so this little cross represents marriage of a male and female. So this is the male, this is his wife. And these are the wife's offspring. The dashed arrow here represents transfer of property from the male to the wife's offspring. Now, in a monogamous situation, by definition, a man has only one wife. So the man's resources are transferred to the wife's offspring. And by definition, there is only one wife. So in this setting, it is possible to avoid any division of the male's resources. Of course, the wife can have many children. Human societies have norms of unigeniture, such as primogeniture. In primogeniture, for example, the firstborn son will inherit all of the property. And so if you couple unigeniture, forms of unigeniture with monogamous marriage, then you have a system where you don't need to divide a man's resources among heirs. Yes?
Sorry, what's primogeniture?
So primogeniture is a system of inheritance where the firstborn son of the wife inherits. These are what we call unigeniture inheritance rules. So, for example, there's a thing called ultimogeniture where the last-born son inherits. It's much more rare than primogeniture. There's another one which I can never pronounce, but it's basically the first child to marry inherits a lot of the property, or sometimes the last child to marry inherits the property. So it's basically a way of restricting number of heirs. Primogeniture is the most common. Okay, so as I said, monogamous marriage coupled with norms of unigeniture is a way of limiting the number of heirs to a man's property. So this suggests that monogamous marriage may be advantageous where the value of resources is depleted through division among multiple heirs. And if we look at the anthropological literature, this seems to be the case in societies that practice intensive modes of production such as plough or irrigation agriculture, which are typically, where productivity is typically very high. High productivity in the long run leads to scarcity of land. So land is a limiting factor to productivity. And what this means is that if you start off with a big plot of land and then you start dividing this among your heirs, over the generation you end up with very small plots and not really very good for anything. So land is not available, land is scarce, and so you can't just move somewhere else and get a new plot of land. Now contrast this with what happens in a polygynous family when you have a man has multiple wives, and each wife has a set of offspring. Now in this case, the man's resources will be divided among the wife's offspring. So in this case, some form of division of a man's estate is inevitable. Now of course, polygynous societies like monogamous societies have norms of unigeniture like primogeniture, but in this case, for example, what would happen is that the firstborn son of each wife would inherit a share of the resources. It's very hard to convince a second wife to marry you if she knows that all of a man's resources will go to the offspring of the first wife. And we do have systems where only the first wife inherits, but these are usually what we call concubinage. So in concubinage systems, you have one wife and then lesser wives or concubines, where by definition the offspring do not inherit. But that is, in our framework, that would be a form of monogamous marriage. No. I'll get references from you. Okay, so this is sort of just an example to show you how in a polygynous system you cannot avoid dividing, to some degree, dividing resources among heirs. So this suggests that a polygynous marriage system could be advantageous where the value of resources is not depleted through division. And again, the anthropological literature tells us that this is the case in what we call extensive modes of production, such as horticulture or pastoralism, where availability of the productive resources is not as crucial as it is in intensive agriculture. What is crucial here is the amount of labor that you have to work with these resources. So to give you an example, in horticultural system, typically in African horticultural system, Land is freely available. At marriage, a man will clear a plot of land because people don't care much about owning the land. People care about having enough wives and offspring to work the land. In pastoralism, obviously, owning the cattle and livestock is very important. But think of it this way: if you split a herd in two, cattle reproduce. So over time, you have a chance of getting back to the original herd size. Whereas splitting a plot in two, where land is limited, land doesn't reproduce. So this is sort of the key difference here. Okay, so this is sort of to illustrate the first principle, this principle of depletion through division. The second principle is what I mentioned, what I called the principle of higher paternity for exclusive investment. And this works as follows. So until now, I've described cases where men transfer resources to their wives' offspring. There are some societies, however, where men transfer resources instead to their sister's offspring. So this would be a man's sister, and the man transfers resources to her offspring. These are what we call matrilineal societies that practice matrilineal inheritance. It's kind of a strange practice. Why do we have this? Now, one model to explain this is what is known as the paternity threshold model. It was first proposed by Richard Alexander in the 70s and then formalized by Penelope Green in the late 70s. And it basically says that you find matrilineal inheritance, the transfer of property to a sister's offspring, where men cannot really be sure of being related to their wife's offspring. So if we plot the coefficient of relatedness as a function of probability of paternity, what you see is that for most values of P, a man is more closely related to his wife's offspring, represented by this black line here. There's a threshold value of P below which a man is more closely related to his sister's offspring, represented by this bluish line here, than he is to his wife's offspring. So this model predicts that when paternity is so low that it's below this threshold value, then men should invest in their sister's offspring, and when P is above this threshold value, then men should invest in their wife's offspring. It's a sort of very general idea. And there is some sort of confirmation for this idea, because if you look at societies cross-culturally, matrilineal societies tend to be societies that have low paternity. So, for example, divorce is very frequent. Female sexual fidelity is not enforced as much as in patrilineal societies, so societies that practice this form of inheritance. Now, this model assumes that there is a selective pressure on males to allocate investment, to invest their resources strategically based on the level of paternity. So Mark and I have extended this model to say, well, if there is such a selective pressure on males, then there may well be a selective pressure on females to allocate paternity strategically by modifying their behavior. And so these two selective pressures can balance out in a system where both males and females benefit, and by basically only interacting with one spouse. And specifically, females would benefit from exclusive investment in their husband's resources in their own offspring, and males, on the other hand, would benefit from being able to invest the resources in the wife's offspring, knowing that the wife's offspring are in fact their own offspring as well. So this is what I mean by investing safely in the wife's offspring.
What man knows his father?
Right, indeed. Whereas maternity is always certain. A woman always knows who her children are. Indeed. So this is a sort of this principle of paternity certainty for exclusive investment. Okay, now this sort of reasoning makes sense to us, but we wanted to see whether it actually holds when we model this formally. So we set up a model where we have a relatively simple model where we have a parent generation and an offspring generation. So just to remind you, these little crosses represent marriage between these two individuals, and these solid lines represent sibling relationships. So these are sister and brother. And these are offspring of this female. So in the model, we have two marriage strategies for both males and females. So both males and females can marry monogamously or polygamously. We have two paternity strategies. So females can give the husbands either high or low paternity by behaving accordingly. hen males can transfer resources either to the sister's offspring, this is what we call diagonal transfer, or to the wife's offspring, this is what we call vertical transfer. Now, to capture this trade-off between allocation of paternity and allocation of investment, we include what are called conditional strategies. These are strategies so where the behavior of an individual depends on the behavior of an individual that it interacts with. So the conditional female strategy is what we call astute females. These are females who give the husbands high paternity only if the husbands are monogamous, otherwise they give low paternity. And the conditional male strategy is what we call suspicious males. These are males who invest in the wife's offspring, so who transfer resources vertically, only if the wife is monogamous and gives high paternity. So only a suspicious male will transfer resources to the wife's offspring only if he knows he can invest in the wife's offspring safely, otherwise it will transfer to the sister's offspring. Okay. So this setup gives us 8 male and 8 female strategies. The ones that I didn't mention are the ones that you shouldn't worry about. They're just the reciprocal of the conditions. So they're sort of our stupid strategies. We have to put this in the model, but they're not really interesting. And what we do in this kind of model is we set up males and female strategies, so combinations of males and female strategies against each other, and we see which combinations of male and female strategies are stable against invasion by individuals playing mutant alternative strategies. So these are what we call, the strategies that are stable are what we call the evolutionarily stable strategies, and these are what we're interested in. Okay, so these are all the strategies that are stable. Different colors mean different combinations of transfer strategy, paternity strategy, and inheritance strategy. And I will talk you through the 2 that result in monogamous marriage, because both males and females are monogamous. So, the first thing to notice here is that in both cases males are suspicious. So these are our conditional males. And just to remind you, these are males who invest in the wife's offspring if the wife is monogamous and gives high paternity. Otherwise, they invest in sister's offspring. These are the sort of clever males, if you like. Now, the first female strategy that paired with this strategy gives monogamous marriage and is evolutionarily stable is females who always give high paternity. They give high paternity indiscriminately to any males, whether they marry monogamously or polygynously. Okay, and this very busy slide tells you where monogamy is stable, so bear with me now, I'll talk you through it. So we have monogamous suspicious males and monogamous high paternity females. This combination of males and female strategy results in monogamous marriage, transfer of property to wives' offspring, so vertical transfer, and high paternity. So I'm showing you here the simplest case where females give absolute paternity certainty to their husbands, but as I'll show you, this doesn't really matter. And in this particular case, mutant males, if they're polygynous, have 2 wives. Again, this is just detail, doesn't really matter. Now what you see in the plot, you see the relative male contribution to the resources transferred to the next generation, represented by this dm here on the horizontal axis. So when dm equals 1, then males are contributing all of the resources transferred to the next generation and females are contributing nothing. When dm equals 0, then males are contributing nothing and females are contributing everything that is inherited by the next generation. When dm equals 0.5, then they're contributing equal shares. Now this parameter z here simply represents, well, it describes the relationship between inherited resources and fitness, but it basically tells us whether you have this effective depletion through division, so when z is greater than 1, or whether you don't have this, and this is when z is less than 1. Now the plot here tells you where monogamy is stable. So these are the different shaded areas are the conditions for stability against different mutant strategies. So A, this area here, is the condition for stability against monogamous males who transfer diagonally. C is the condition for stability against polygynous males who transfer diagonally. And B is the condition for stability against polygynous males who transfer vertically. Now, all you need to understand here is that monogamy is stable in this little shaded area here where all these 3 conditions meet. So they cannot be invaded by, monogamy monogamy with suspicious males cannot be invaded by any mutant male strategy. And so what this is telling us, this particular plot here, is that monogamy is stable where the value of resources is not depleted through division. This is represented by values of Z greater than 1. And this is something that we built into the model, so it's sort of not unexpected. But the one thing that we did not build into the model that was interesting to us is that, as you can see, monogamy is only stable when the M is very high. So where the relative male contribution to the resources is high. Where the relative male contribution to the resources is low, such that the female contribution to the resources is high, then monogamy is not stable. It's not stable, so polygyny is stable. So intuitively, what this means is that if you're a man and in your society you can marry a wife and the wife provides all of the resources for her children, then your best strategy is simply to marry as many wives as possible, because wives are taking care of their own children, right? So when this is not the case, then monogamy may actually be a more clever thing to do. And this is interesting to us because if you look at the evolutionary literature on marriage strategies, the assumption is that polygyny is always beneficial for males. So to actually find the monogamy is sometimes beneficial for males is actually very interesting to us. Now, I'm showing you here, as I said, the simplest case when females are giving males absolute paternity certainty. This is sort of unrealistic. And I'm showing you here another unrealistic case because in this case, paternity certainty is very low. Estimates for contemporary populations range from 0.7 to 0.95. So, and I'm just showing you here to show you that even when you have this unrealistically low level of paternity, monogamy is still stable. Okay, so that was the first case when females always give high paternity. Now I'm going to talk you through the second case when females sometimes give high paternity and sometimes they give low paternity. So they give high paternity to monogamous husbands and low paternity to polygynous husbands. Okay, so we have, again, monogamous suspicious males and monogamous astute females. Again, if you put these two combinations of strategies, this combination of strategies together, what you have is monogamous marriage, transfers of property to wives, offspring, and high paternity. Now, the M, as before, is the relative contribution of males to resources transferred to the next generation. So again, when the M is 1, then males are contributing all. When the M is 0, then females are contributing all and males are contributing nothing. Z is, as before, this parameter that describes the relationship between inherited resources and fitness. Z greater than 1 means that there is depletion through division, and Z less than 1 means that there is no depletion through division. Now, there's an extra thing here. So pH, as before, is the level of paternity that females give to the husbands, but in this case, because they are astute females, they give high paternity to, so they gave this level of paternity to monogamous husbands, and they give this level of paternity PL to polygynous husbands. So we have two levels of paternity here. And in this case, monogamy is stable throughout this volume here. And what this is showing you is that, as before, monogamy is stable up here, so for values of Z greater than 1 and for high male contribution. And again, this means that monogamy is stable where dividing resources is costly, when having multiple heirs is costly. However, as you can see, the range of parameter values for which monogamy is stable increases a lot. And it increases thanks to this PL here. So what this is telling us is that when PL is low relative to pH, then monogamy is actually advantageous. For example, below this threshold value, it's advantageous for all values of DM and for a range of values of Z. So it's not simply advantageous just for Z greater than 1, it's actually advantageous also for Z less than 1. And the reason for this is that if PL is very low, and you're a man and you marry many, many, many wives, yes, you do have a lot of wives who produce a lot of offspring, but if PL is low, you don't know that those offspring are actually your own offspring. So there's no point marrying polygynously because your wives are having a lot of offspring, but not with you. So there is a sort of social cost to polygyny, if you like. This is sort of the social cost to polygyny. So if this cost is very high, so this level of paternity is low, then marrying polygynously is not actually advantageous over marrying monogamously. Now, I'm showing you here the same thing, again, for a low level of paternity that wives give their husbands, simply to illustrate that you don't need this sort of very unrealistically high level of paternity for this system to be stable. Okay, now, so this framework sort of intuitively lets us understand, or provides one way to understand variation in marriage and inheritance strategies. Now, how does this fit with what we know about the history and distribution of marriage strategies from the historical and archaeological and ethnographic record? Now, for one thing, we know that that monogamous marriage is prevalent in Eurasian societies. And these are societies that traditionally have practiced intensive modes of production, such as plough or irrigation agriculture. And if you remember, these are modes of production where land is scarce and it's a limiting factor to productivity. So this is represented in the model by values of z greater than 1. Now, interestingly, these are societies that, if you do a cross-cultural analysis of distribution of marriage strategies and look at the the relative contribution of females to production, then in these societies, females tend to have low contributions compared to polygynous societies. And I'll tell you later what this means when I will talk about polygynous societies. And then finally, sort of traditionally, these are societies that have high paternity norms, such as enforcement of premarital virginity or enforcement of sexual fidelities and ideologies of sexual fidelities. And so if we put all this together with the framework that we've developed, then our intuition would be that monogamous marriage emerged with the transition from extensive to intensive modes of production, so with the introduction of plough agriculture or irrigation agriculture, and possibly coupled with these high paternity norms, made monogamy more and more likely. Now, contrast this with what we know about the history and distribution of polygynous marriage. So polygynous marriage is practically universal in sub-Saharan Africa. And these are societies that traditionally have practiced extensive modes of production, so horticulture or pastoralism. So sort of horticultural system, typical system is that a man at marriage clears a plot of land for his wife, and then the wife works the land and raises her children from the produce of the land. Oftentimes, she actually has to give the husband some of the produce. He can just go and sell. But so she basically takes care of her own offspring. And so this is what I mean when I say that there's sort of relative high female contribution to production compared to monogamous systems. So female is basically contributing a lot of what her children inherit and inherit. And then finally, an interesting sort of fact is that, again, if we looked at the cross-cultural data, access to new land for expansion is a key determinant of polygyny. So when land becomes scarce, you actually see that polygyny becomes more and more difficult. So sort of anecdotally, this sort of supports our notion that, again, as land becomes scarce, monogamy becomes more advantageous. Okay, so the model, sort of the framework is intuitively appealing to us, but it sort of generates some predictions that we can go and test against the archaeological, historical, and ethnographic data. So in the archaeological data, we expect to see norms that enforce monogamous marriage to emerge with intensive agriculture, with the introduction of intensive agriculture, sometimes in the Neolithic, and possibly coupled with these high paternity norms. Now, in the historical record, we expect transitions between marriage systems to be linked to transitions in availability of land and more generally in subsistence systems. And then finally, in the ethnographic record, we expect marriage and transfer strategy to somehow be linked. Now, unfortunately, we don't really have very good archaeological data to test this, partly because we have so far lacked a sort of framework to understand variation in marriage strategies, and so the data that have been collected have not been collected systematically to speak to this notion. The historical data is again anecdotal. We have a few documented cases of transitions from polygyny to monogamy. The reverse transition from monogamy to polygyny, we only really have the Mormon case. And again, so it's very hard to do anything with one data point. But we do have a lot of ethnographic data on marriage and transfer strategies, so we can sort of start testing these ideas with the ethnographic data. And so this is what I'll show you. So the notion here being that if marriage strategies are indeed a way to sort of allocate resources across generations, then they should co-vary with transfer strategies which determine how property is transferred across generations. So I'm using the data that I've shown you before. So again, these are data from Murdoch and White's standard cross-cultural sample. This is just to reiterate, this is a database of 186 societies that is representative of variation in human cultural practices. So we have things like marriage strategies, subsistence strategies, and so forth. And what I've done here is I've asked whether across societies we can actually see an association between monogamous marriage and vertical transfer property. If you remember, the two cases in which monogamous marriage is stable result in a vertical transfer of property. So I use a technique that is called hierarchical log linear analysis, and I've used data from the standard cross-cultural sample. I have data for 87 societies where I have information on all of these four variables. So I've looked at marriage strategy, the transfer strategy for land, just the transfer strategy for movable property, so things like livestock, money, and other objects. And then I've also included religious affiliation, because there are some theories that link marriage strategies and inheritance strategies to Christianization. So I put this in here just to control for it, essentially. Okay, so I'm showing you here just plots, the sort of distributions of these traits. So the societies represented by circles are included in the analysis, or are those 87 societies that I've actually that have data for all the variables that I've included in the analysis. So white is monogamous, and as you can see, there's monogamous marriages prevalent in Eurasia. There is very little, well, there is none in sub-Saharan Africa, and there is some in the Americas. Vertical transfer of land is found in Eurasia again. There's quite a bit in Africa and some in the Americas. Vertical transfer of movable property, on the other hand, is much more common. Quite a bit in Africa as well as in Eurasia and in the Americas. And then finally, this is the distribution of Christianity at contact with after contact with European and Western societies, Western civilization. So shortly after colonization. Okay, so these are the results. Now, hierarchical log linear modeling is a technique that is used to model cell counts in contingency tables of two or more categorical variables. And the notion here is that we want to produce a model that can generate a similar distribution of cases in a contingency table of our variables, including the smallest number of possible effects. So the way we do this is we start with all possible interaction between variables, and then we start taking out interactions one by one, and we see which, and we only keep in the model the ones that actually make the model worse if we take them out. So a good model will have a non-significant goodness of fit statistic, indicating that the cell counts that the model produces are not different from the observed cell counts. And also it will have small values of the standardized cell residuals, meaning that the deviations between the observed and expected cell counts are not large. Okay, so let me talk you through this. So the model retains the four first order effects, and it simply means that the distribution of cases between the levels of the four variables is not 50-50. So I showed you, in fact, I showed you this data earlier. Here. So basically, we have in the sample we have 23% of monogamous societies, and 77% of societies are polygynous. So inclusion of the first order effects simply means that these proportions are different from 50-50, not very interesting. What are interesting are the second order effects. And the second order effects basically tell us which interactions are significant. So interactions that are significant, so there are 6 possible second order effects, and we only retain these 3. And these are the interaction of transfer of property by transfer of land, marriage strategy by transfer of land, and marriage strategy by religion. The only one thing I want to look at here is the magnitude of these effects. The strongest association is this, the interaction between transfer of property and transfer of movables and transfer of land, whereas these other 2 interactions have comparable effects. And to sort of give you a visual illustration of these results, the one result that we're most interested in is this plot here. So basically this is telling us that vertical transfer of land is found in a much larger proportion of monogamous societies than in polygynous societies. So vertical transfer of land is found in 90% of monogamous societies and only in 55% of polygynous societies. So this is actually what we expect from our predictions. The other interesting thing that we find is that if you look, as I said, there is this very strong, in fact, the strongest interaction in the model is this association between transfer of land and transfer of movables. So we find vertical transfer of land in a significantly larger proportion of societies that also have vertical transfer of movables compared to societies that don't have vertical transfer of movables. And so given this convergence of transfer strategies for the 2 types of property, it's sort of interesting to us that we only find this association for vertical transfer of land. It seems that monogamous societies specifically regulate the transfer of land and specifically have norms that enforce vertical transfer of land. So this is actually a very interesting result for us, and it confirms what we expect from the model. So this is where I end, having talked for a long time. And basically, I end with this book, which is a book, one of many theoretical books and articles in anthropology, which try and sort of answer the question of whether marriage serves primarily a productive and economic function or a sexual and reproductive function. And the one thing we think we've shown with our framework is that if we put all these notions into an evolutionary context, then we can actually understand productive and economic factors are as proximate determinants of the ultimate reproductive function of marriage. So let me just thank my collaborator on this, with Marco Archetti, various people who've provided feedback, various people who've provided money, the Santa Fe Institute, which is where I work, and also here's my email address if you want to contact me with any questions or comments. Thank you.
Do you have any questions for Laura?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm impressed, but I'm puzzled. But you have a binary opposition between monogamous and polygynous society. But if we talk about actual individual people making decisions, the overwhelming majority of decisions in polygynous societies are, in fact, monogamous. It's impossible to have polygyny among more than a small percentage of families. And your statistics show that the majority of societies have polygyny of less than 1%.
Right.
I don't understand the dichotomy between monogamous and polygynous, when in fact most polygynous people are monogamous.
Right. So you're right. There is a lot of variation within societies in all of these practices. But as anthropologists, unless we have very good data, individual level data, which we don't have, for many of these practices, what we can study are norms. And so what we're doing here is studying the presence of a norm of enforcement of monogamous marriage, and we do this dichotomy because it's simply useful and easy to do so. In terms of, so one way to interpret what we do with what you say is that in polygynous societies, typically polygyny is a sign of wealth. And so it's the older men and the powerful men that are able to marry many wives. So typically, for example, in African polygynous societies, a man has to provide what we call a bride wealth to marry. So he provides a large number of camels, if it's the pastoralist societies, for example, to the bride's family. And so it takes a lot of wealth to be able to do this. And so it's the powerful men who actually do this. And so it's not implausible that it's actually these powerful men that decide whether the society should allow polygyny or should not allow polygyny. So I see your point, but this is how we sort of interpret these norms. As it's the powerful men who decide what norm is enforced in the society. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Here. Right. So polygyny is black here, right? So sub-Saharan Africa is pretty much polygynous, and in the Middle East, so there just aren't very many societies. And this is an artifact of how these societies were sampled. So they were sampled to sort of minimize similarity through history. Oops. So knowing how these societies were sampled, my intuition would be that, they, from the sort of Middle Eastern Muslim cultural area, they only picked one society. So. Because the notion is, if you have a sample like this and you're trying to do statistics of the kind that I've shown you, if you take societies that all share a common ancestor, you're basically counting the same thing many, many times. Because in this ancestor, this particular trait only arose once, but you're counting it many, many times. So you're oversampling that particular instance. So it's one way of addressing this issue of relatedness by descent.
Yeah, because you know that they all got the polygyny from in the same way.
Yeah, yeah. So if you minimize how closely they are historically, you're trying to minimize this effect.
That also assumes that you know the history of
Yeah,
the
yeah. Either way you do this, there's some assumptions involved. So this is one way of doing it with some assumptions. Yes. Right. That is a very interesting question, actually. And so the specific answer is I don't know, but what I can tell you is that so I've talked about societies where there is property to transfer, but there are a number of societies that don't have property to transfer. Typically, forager societies, hunter-gatherer societies don't have property. Property might be I don't know, some pots or something. So there isn't a large amount of property. And what you do see in these societies, these are societies that typically have high rates of monogamous marriage within the societies, but don't enforce monogamous marriage. So if you are a very powerful hunter who can come back and kill, 3 buffalo, then you can actually afford many, many wives, because you can actually support many, many wives with those 3 buffaloes. But most men cannot do that, and so they will only have 1 wife. So those are societies where monogamy within the society is prevalent, but there is no norm to enforce monogamy. And so in some ways, what you're talking about this doesn't necessarily apply just to sort of urban poor societies, but in fact to Western societies in general, where property isn't as important as it was in the past, right? So it's things like education that you can't really, you can transfer, but to a certain degree. Whereas if we look at the historical European societies, land was really a key determinant of how well you did in life. So the similar reasoning could apply to sort of Western society in general, I argue. What the reason would be, I don't know. Yeah. Oh yes. Yeah. Yes.
So sort of the strategy, the marriage strategies that you laid out, they seem to make a lot of sense. So that's after a lot of analysis. I don't understand how, like, society can have that much foresight, to realize that a certain marriage
Sure.
strategy is it some kind of social Darwinism that just kind of gets the values of society?
It depends what you mean by social Darwinism. If you mean the same thing that I mean, no. So social Darwinism is usually understood as this notion that the fittest societies will survive, right? And there's this notion of progress involved in that, where societies are going from this sort of barbarian state to a sort of more evolved state, and that is absolutely not what I mean. I just mean the way we intend this, which is sort of Darwinism without the social part, is that societies that do a thing that is good for the particular environment will actually be better. So societies try out different things, and some things work and some things don't work. And so societies that stick with the thing that work in that particular environment will do well. So this is sort of, so there is no foresight as in the sense that people sit down and decide, okay, from today we're going to be monogamous because this is what is good. So in some way, people do something, and then this crystallizes in the society as a social norm, and this is what we observe. Right.
Probably what now means is that maybe there were like a lot of societies who did evolutionarily the wrong thing, but they haven't survived.
Right.
They weren't doing very well.
And actually, so if you look at the history in Europe, and I talk about Europe because it's where we have a lot of documented history, there have been a few cases where societies, like a handful, where societies have tried to switch, for example, back to polygyny. Didn't last very long. The thing is also that when you have a norm enforced, it's very hard to deviate from the norm, right? But it must be a point when there is sort of norms are sort of flexible and not established yet, and in that case, there is. I imagine that there can be a lot of experimenting going on. Yes. Remind me where Alabama is. Here. So these are societies sampled at contact. So these are Native American societies. Yeah. So within our framework, it would be the last 12,000 years of history. So agriculture roughly started some 10,000 years ago in parts of the world around here. That's very hard to say. I mean, it really depends. I would imagine that things like this, once they're established, because they determine so much of how the society behaves and how the society is structured, I would imagine these things to be quite resilient to change. Other norms like fashion, for example, conventions of how we dress, those change very quickly. So maybe Stefano can probably speak to this. Do we have good estimates of rates of change in cultural evolution? For fashion, we know it's very fast, it's very easy to measure, but things like these. So I spoke a little bit about, transitions between marriage systems, and I know of a couple of cases. So in the Muslim world, I think Tunisia and Turkey now forbid polygyny, although it still happens in rural communities. I think it's by law, it's actually forbidden. And so these are changes that have happened on our, timescales that we can observe in, I think Tunisia, it was 1956, or I forget exactly, but so in the last 100 years.
And then to test your hypothesis would be meaningful to see whether the property structure.
Exactly. So yeah. But we have so few cases, and of course the other transition from polygyny to monogamy, the only one I can think of is the transition, is sort of Mormon, going from sort of Christian monogamy to Mormon polygyny. But again, it's one data point, so it's very hard to.
There are several Christian Orthodox churches, like with the rise.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe
that's a good point. Yeah, they're also, typically they tend to be very secretive with their data. Because, polygyny is so...
That's evolutionary.
Yeah, that's not evolutionarily, it's not a very clever thing.
Oh, I suppose you have to meet that question?
No.
Oh,
Yes.
Just curious, what's the social structure of the 1% society in which there's small females?
So those are the polyandrous societies. That's actually very interesting case. So in these societies we have one wife. Typically it's what we call fraternal or Adelphic polyandry. So wife marries a set of brothers. And the way this is, it's actually strange because usually the wife marries the eldest brother and then the others just, she gets the whole package. And so, the eldest brother might be 20 and then the youngest one can be an infant. So you have these strange situations. But it's actually a very interesting practice. It's geographically very clustered. It's clustered in Tibet. So it's a Tibetan, we have some documented cases in southern India. Some very rare cases, I think, in the Pacific. But mostly it's the culturally Tibetan societies that practice this. And so the explanation for this, again, sort of hand-wavy kind of explanation, is that these are, highland Tibetan agriculture is very unproductive. So if you like, this is a sort of very extreme case of not dividing the resources, because what happens is that a set of brothers inherits the farm, the family farm. And so if a set of brothers marries one wife, then the wife can only have so many children. So this is an extreme form of unigeniture, if you like, where you're really, really limiting the number of offspring that you have. And it's sort of, again, it's anecdotal, but what we do find is that as, and in fact, the cases that we have described nowadays are from Nepal, again, culturally Tibetan societies in Nepal. What we do find is that when opportunities for labor, for example, in the cities arise, typically the younger brothers leave the sort of polyandrous marriage and go to the city and get their own monogamous sort of family set up.
So there is no recorded case of polygynandry.
It depends on how you define polygynandry. So in my definition, those cases of polyandry, the ones that I've studied, actually are polygynandry because although polygyny is very rare, it is not forbidden. So by my definition, those would actually be cases of polygynandry. But in literature, polyandry was this very exotic thing that anthropologists got all excited and just said, oh.
And the radical form of polygynandry where in the same family you have multiple.
So in these societies, the rates are very low, but typically what happens is, for example, you have a set of brothers, you marry one wife and the wife is infertile. Then you have no heirs to the estate, or you get bored or whatever, and so you actually are allowed to take a second wife. For the cases that I've seen data for, these are like 1% of all marriages, so it's actually very rare, but it's not forbidden.
1%
of the 1%, yeah. So actually very, very rare, yeah.
One question. Do we actually have any idea of when paternity is discovered? Because in Roman society, pointed out, and that the paternal side is all about property and control and inheritance, but the mother side is all about warmth and friendship.
Right. Yeah.
So when is paternity actually discovered in terms of operating criteria?
Well, so paternity testing is the only thing that can tell you for sure.
Well, exactly. So,
but we do actually have, so if you look at non-human species, males have good ways of telling who's their children or not, just through odor or visual cues. And actually, in humans, we have some experiments that show that if you go to maternity wards, then the mother's parents are always telling everybody how much the baby looks like the father. Babies all look the same. You can't really tell. Newborn baby, you can't really tell. But so it seems that there are these sort of psychological ways of convincing fathers that they're related. So I think paternity testing is a very recent thing, but individuals have had a good idea.
In societies that feminists are aware that the problem.
The Ephesians makes a point about this. At the point at which it's discovered that the father is actually the father, change takes place in property.
So this is Marx's theory, right? This is Engels' theory. The reason I don't like Engels' theory is actually very similar to us. It resonates quite a lot. But the key difference is that they sort of see women as this sort of passive thing. And if you look at history, I showed you the Babylonian case. Women could actually tell their husbands, nope, you don't get a second wife. I mean, how much they actually had the freedom to say that, in society, or there was simply a rule, is not clear. But if you look at the ethnographic record, actually, there is a lot of evidence where females have a lot of say in what the husbands do. So the reason I don't like Engels' theory is that, women are just sort of passive things and individuals, and men just decide history. Whereas, the ethnographic data show that, in some cases, there is a very interesting case where the husband does get what he wants in the end. But there's this sort of ritualized procedure where the wife, the husband comes home and says, honey, I'm going to get a second wife, and she runs away back to her mother, and then he has to go there and sort of go through this very humiliating process where he has to beg her to come back. So, women have had in history, it's the Plateau Tonga, described by Colson. Right. It sounds like right. Right. There are many cases. Like this. So.